In this video, we're going to learn about the Winston logging package for Node.js applications. And this is a versatile logging package that can be used in multiple scenarios and different frameworks in Node.js. In this video, we're going to dive into the core functionalities provided by Winston, including things like log levels, transports, which determine where you can send your log files to. We will look at formatting options, which determine what the output log entries look like. And we'll also look at how we can use Winston to perform basic code profiling. And finally, we'll see how we can perform log centralization at the end of this video, where we send our logs to a central service such as 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗽𝗀 for further analysis. So we've got a lot to cover, let's dive in and get started. Now we're on the GitHub page for Winston here. As it says in the About section, this is a logger for just about everything. So a rather bold claim there. Let's go down to the README and we're going to explore some of the functionality and features that Winston has. So we're going to set this up in a second, but let's have a quick look at the motivation. Winston is designed to be a simple and universal logging library with support for multiple transports. And a transport is essentially a storage device for your logs, and each Winston logger can have multiple transports. Now we'll see more about transports later, but they basically determine where you're going to send your logs. And that could be a file, it could be the console, it could be some central service such as 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗽𝗀, or even a relational database or MongoDB. Now the point that each Winston logger can have multiple transports, we're going to see an example of that in this video. And one example is you might want your error logs to be stored in a persistent remote location such as a database, whereas all other logs, for example info and debug logs, you might want to output those levels to the console or to some local file on your file system. Now we're going to look at the usage section below in a second, and we're going to set up a project with Winston. Before we do that, it would be amazing if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're finding this content useful. By subscribing, you're going to help us reach more viewers, and that would be greatly appreciated. Let's move on. We're going to open VS Code, and I'm going to set up a Node.js project. So we have a terminal at the bottom. We can run the npm init-y command in order to actually set up this project, and that will create a package.json file on the left hand side. And then once we've done that, we can install the Winston package, npm install Winston. With that command, it's going to add Winston to the package.json file, and it's going to bring Winston and all of its dependencies down and store them in the node modules directory. So we have Winston installed, and what we're going to do now is we're going to work in this file here. It's called app.js. This is a JavaScript file, and we're going to define some code here for logging. Let's go back to the GitHub page, and we're going to go down here a little bit, and we're going to go to the table of contents. And this page is linked below the video if you need to get access to this. We're going to go to the section on logging, which is here. And this is going to allow us to create a simple logger in Winston, and then we can extend that example. Now you can see in this JavaScript object the levels that are defined in the Winston package. And these are the default levels, but you can actually change those under the hood. And what we have are the levels ordered by their severity. So the most severe level we have is the error log level. And we also have log levels such as warn, info, http, verbose, debug, and of course silly. And each level has a number associated with it. And the lower the number, the more severe the level is. We can take advantage of these levels, and we're going to see that in a second. Let's now go down to this section on creating our own logger. What we need to do is we need to use a function on Winston called createLogger. And that function, you can pass configuration to that as a JavaScript object. And one example of that is a list of transports that you want to be applied to this logger. And the logger accepts the following options as part of its configuration. We have things like the level and the transports. We're going to see these now if we go to VS Code. So what I'm going to do at the top here is I'm going to import Winston. So let's create a variable called Winston, and we'll use the require function, and we're going to import Winston. We can then go down and create another variable called logger by using that winston.createLogger function. And that, as we saw in GitHub, takes a JavaScript object of configuration. We can pass a default level, and we're going to set that just to debug as an example. We can also pass a format for the log output, and we're going to use one of the formats in the winston.format object. And the one we're going to use is the JSON format. And finally, we're going to pass some transports into this logger, and that's going to be a JavaScript array. And the first one is going to be for the console. So I'm going to use the new statement, and it's going to be a new winston.transports.console object. So the console object is going to output the logs to the console, basically standard output or standard error. And then below that, I'm going to copy this statement down and we're going to use the file transport, which obviously is going to output the logs to a file. So we can specify the name of that file by adding another configuration object and passing the file name. And I'm going to use, let's just say app.log for this example. So what we have here is a logger object in Winston with a level of debug with an output format of JSON and with two transports configured, one going to the console and the other to a file called app.log. So now that we have the logger, we can use that and we can use the log level methods on that object. Let's see an example of that now. We can use the logger.info method, and that is going to output a log entry with the level of info. And that's going to take a message. So let's pass a generic message for now and just say an info log. And I'm going to copy that line just below here. And we're going to use another logger method, another level, and that's going to be logger.error, and we'll change the message there to an error log. Now let's run this app.js file. So what I'm going to do is use the node command and we're going to run app.js, and we can see the output from those two log level methods. We have the first one, which is an info level, and we get the message for that one, which just said an info log, and we get the same for our error log as well. So we can take advantage of these methods that are defined on the logger object in order to output logs to whatever transports we have configured. Now a logger has a level associated with it, and by default that's going to be info, and that means that any logs with a severity that are less severe than info are not going to be output, they're going to be discarded. So let's see an example of what that means. I'm going to change this level of debug to warn, and this means that only levels of warn and above are going to be output. So for the two functions we have here, we're not going to see the logger.info call because info is not as severe as the level we have configured on this logger object. So that's not going to show up on the terminal or in the file, whereas the error message will. So let's see an example now of that. I'm going to clear the terminal and we can see we only get the error message. And if we look at the file on the left hand side, the app.log file was created because we have a file transport with that file name. So if we look at the contents of that file, we can see our logs are also being sent to this file via that file transport. And we can actually define a different level on the transports themselves. So I'm going to change this back to info, but let's say this app.log file, we might want to only output the error messages to this file. The file transport can take a level parameter as well, and we can set that to error. So I'm going to clear the app.log file and we're going to see what kind of output we get in that and also in the terminal. So let's rerun app.js. On the console here, we can see both of the logs from these functions, whereas if we go to app.log, because we've set the level on the transport, we only get the error output. So we've seen how to use multiple transports here on our logger, and Winston comes with many transports, many community written transports. I'm going to go to this BetterStack article, and there's a link to this article in the description. We have a section on custom transports in Winston, and you can see some of these community transports. One for MongoDB, one for Syslog, Telegram, and of course the BetterStack transport as well, which we'll see later in the video, and a transport for MySQL too. And there are many more in addition to these. If you're interested in videos on any of those, just let us know in the comments. So let's go back to VS Code. We've seen how to define a logger and how to use the logger methods for each level. We're now going to look at how to format the logs. Now the default format just contains the level and the message that was sent into the method. And that is output in JSON format. And we've set the format to JSON here, but that's actually the default in Winston. So it outputs in a structured JSON format, but we can change this as well. And there are different formats and different utilities in the Winston.format module. We're going to use another one now just to demonstrate this, and that's the CLI format. And this is useful for command line applications. So this is going to work well with the console, but we're going to comment out the file transport at the moment. And we're going to run this and see how the output changes. So let's run app.js, and you can see here we now have some colorization of the log level as well as the message being printed out as well. Now this is more human readable, I would say. Rather than an object with key value pairs, we're just getting an output here that's useful for the console and for debugging. However, the JSON format has other advantages. It's a structured format, and that means it's easy to extract information from that data that's output in JSON format. Now Winston.format, this is actually an object, and we can destructure some properties from that object at the top here. So I'm going to do that just now. I'm going to define some variables here, and let's get the combine function and the timestamp function and finally the printf function. We're going to destructure these from Winston.format. So we can now use these utilities in the format key that we have on our logger object. So let's do that just now. I'm going to remove the CLI function, and we can use this combine function that we've imported, and what we can pass to that are multiple options here. So I'm going to use the timestamp, and what that's going to do is add the timestamp to the log entries. And we're also going to use the printf function, which gives us a bit of control over the string output for that entry. So let's do that just now. We take the info that's passed in and we generate a string from that. So we can reference some variables here. So we're going to use a JavaScript template string in order to do that. So let's start by referencing info.timestamp here. So we're going to start with the timestamp when the log was generated. And then after that, we can reference info.level. That's the log level for this particular output on the logger. And finally, we should also output the message. So we can reference info.message. And this is going to be the format of our output entries for this logger. So let's try that out on the terminal. If we run node app.js, we get a new output format. We have the timestamp, then we have the log level, and finally the log message. And that corresponds to what we've passed into this printf function. And we have the timestamp object here, which adds that timestamp to the log. So if we comment that out, this is not going to work. As you see in the terminal, for the timestamp, we now have undefined. So we need that timestamp function to be called as part of this combine function that we're passing to format. Let's now move on, and we're going to see how we can add custom entries into our log output. What I'm going to do here for now is remove printf, and we're going to use the JSON format again. So I'm going to remove this printf function, and we can just use JSON. And let's also uncomment the file transport that we have. Now what we want to do is we want to see custom key value pairs appearing in this output. And it turns out this is very easy to do in Winston. If we go down to our level methods here, all we need to do, or one way to do it rather, is to pass a JavaScript object of key value pairs into these functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a variable here, a JavaScript object called requestLog. And let's imagine we were outputting some information from an HTTP request. Let's define that object now, and we're going to give it a couple of keys. The first one is for the HTTP method. I'm going to set that to get, just as part of this example. And also let's add another key here called isAuthenticated. And that is a Boolean field. Let's set that to false for this example. Now let's say we want to output these keys and values as part of the JSON output when we call these logger methods. We can pass the object into these methods just as another parameter here, and I can do the same for logger.error. If we now run this on the terminal, what we're going to get back is a JavaScript object, and you can see the keys of isAuthenticated as well as the method here. They have been added to the log entries and their output on each transport that's configured. So we're also going to see these in the app.log file. You can see that here with isAuthenticated, so it's very easy to add these custom key value pairs into your log entries. And if this is a common practice to pass the same key value pairs into multiple logger functions in different places in your applications, what you can do is create a child logger in order to consolidate that in a single place. So let's do that just now. What we have at the moment is this request log object, but we don't want to have to pass that request log to every single one of these methods. So what we're going to do is create a child logger and reference that instead of the logger that we've created. In order to do that, we can take this Winston logger and we can call the .child method. So let's do that just below this request log object. And we're going to call that child logger, and we're going to use the logger that we created above and call .child on that. And we can pass in any keys and values that we want to be added by default when we use this child logger. So let's pass the request log object that we created above, and we're going to change the references here from the parent logger to the child logger for both of these functions. So let's now go back to the terminal and run node app.js. I'm going to make this bigger so we can see this, and you can see we still get back those new key value pairs like isAuthenticated. So these are in the output even though we haven't passed the object itself to the methods, and that's because we're now using this child logger. Now this looks a little bit messy on the terminal, so I'm going to show one example from the format module in order to clean this up on the console here. So let's go back to the file here and go to the top. We're going to import another object, another function from the format module, and that's the prettyprint function. And once we've imported that, we can just pass it into this combine method and call it, and that's going to apply some pretty printing to the output JSON file, So when we rerun this, we can see we get back a much cleaner format in the console. So let me make this bigger, and you can see we get back actual JavaScript objects with indentation. So it looks a lot better than it did without the pretty print. And again, this is very useful for human readability, but it's not so important if you're sending your logs to some aggregation service. It just depends on the context of what you're doing. So we've seen how to add custom keys and values to our log outputs, and also how to consolidate those in a central place using a child logger. Let's now move on and see how we can log information about errors in our Winston outputs. Now, when errors occur in your application, it's very good to be able to get log output for those errors to help you identify what's gone wrong. And in Winston, what you need to do at the top here is you need to import the errors format. That's from the Winston.format module. We have a function called errors. And because this is from the format module, we can use it within the format key that we're passing to the create logger statement. So let's use the errors function, and we can pass an object of configuration to the errors format. And I'm going to pass a key called stack and set that to true. And that's going to output the stack trace when you have an exception in your application. So let's see what effect this has. If we go down to the log methods here, we have a child logger.error method. We can pass a new error into that. So let's create a new error here, and we're going to pass the message 504 gateway timeout just as a demonstration. So let's save that and go to the terminal and rerun the app.js file. And you can see this time in the error output here, we have a stack trace. So if you need information about the error that's occurred in your application, you can use this errors format that we've imported and added to the format option. Very simple to do using Winston.js. Let's now move on again, and we're going to see how we can use multiple loggers in an application. Now, it's common practice when you are building apps that you have multiple loggers at different services and different boundaries in your application. And these loggers might have different requirements, different severity levels, and we're going to see a small example of how we might approach that now. So what I'm going to do is create a new file here. I'm going to call it loggers.js. And we're going to create multiple loggers in this file using the winston.loggers.add method. So let's start by going to app.js, and I'm going to copy the imports that we have into loggers.js. And then we can define a logger here with winston.loggers, and then that has an add function. And I'm going to create a logger here. Now let's say we're creating a logger for a payment application. We have an order service and we have a payment service. So we might have separate loggers for each of these. So I'm going to create a logger here called order logger. And this string is just a name that we're giving to the logger that we're going to reference later on. The second parameter here are the options that define that logger. And for these options, I'm going to go back to app.js. And the logger that we have here, I'm going to copy this entire object of configuration that we have. I'm going to cut that out of there, and we're going to paste it into this file here. So the order logger is going to have similar configuration to the logger that we've been working with so far. Now I'm going to change a couple of things here. So let's look at the file transport. I'm going to output the logs for this to a file called orders.log. And I'm going to remove the level here. Let's say we don't need that for the order logger. And I'm going to copy this statement at the top. We're going to add a second logger now for the payment service. So we'll call this one payment logger, and we can pass an object into that to configure that particular logger. So for the format, what I'm going to do is just specify that we want JSON for this logger. And we've imported JSON at the top here from Winston.format, so we can just call it like this. And let's now define some transports. I'm only going to add one transport for the payment logger. And I'm going to copy the file transport that we have from the order service, and we're going to paste that in here and change the file name to payments.log. And that's the basic configuration for these two loggers. I'm going to add one last key to both, and that's a key that we can use called default meta. So any custom key value pairs that we want by default to appear on log outputs, we can add them with an object here that we specify with the default meta key. So we can add a service key here, and that can be anything you want, but we're calling this service, and we're going to say that this one is the order logger service, and I'm going to copy this down to the payment logger, and we can specify that default metadata here as well, and set that equal to, in this case, the payment logger. And actually I'm going to change these. It shouldn't be loggers, it should be services. So the default metadata now says order service and payment service for that key. So we now have two loggers here. What we can do in app.js is import them at the top here. Now we no longer need these options from the format module, but above the Winston import, what I'm going to do is just use the require statement, and we're going to require that loggers.js file, and that will import those loggers. And we can remove this create logger statement, we don't need that anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to fetch these loggers from the other module. So I'm actually going to remove all of this code and we're going to start from scratch. And I'm going to create a function now called payment logger, and we can get that payment logger by using Winston. And again, we access that .loggers property. And you can see the methods on that. We have an add method that we used in the other file. What we're going to do in order to retrieve the logger is use the .get method. And we pass the name of that logger into that. So this one is going to be called payment logger, and that matches what we had as the string parameter to the add method. So we're fetching that logger now, and we're calling the variable payment logger. I'm going to copy that line of code just below, and we're going to create one for the order logger as well. And we need to change the name that's being referenced here to order logger. And once we have these, we can use the log level methods on them. For example, payment logger.info. And let's give this a generic message, payment received. And we can also use the order logger as well, so order logger.error. And let's pass some message here, order failed. Let's now run this file and see what kind of output we get here. And we get back the output for the order service. And we can see the timestamp, the level, and the message. And we can also see this service key, and that matches the key that we added to the logger. So if we go down here, we can see that the order service here, it has a default meta, and we set that as the default meta object. Now we only see the order output because that particular logger is the only one that's outputting to the console. If we look at the payment logger, that only outputs to a file called payments.log. It doesn't have a transport for the console. Now let's go to the left hand side here, and you can see the files have been created. We have an orders.log file, and we also have a payments.log file as well. And the output for the payments is not prettified, it doesn't use that pretty print function, it's just raw JSON being output into the payments.log file. But again, you can see that default meta for the service, so we have that key available because of that property that we added. Let's now move on to log profiling. Now Winston allows you to do some basic profiling of your applications, and what that means when you profile a block of code, you're basically measuring the time that it takes for that code to run and to successfully execute. Let's go back to our app.js file here, and we're going to add some example here that's going to demonstrate how to do this profiling. So let's start by removing these two log level methods, and I'm going to create a function here, and let's just imagine that this was handling some kind of HTTP request on the server, and it's going to take a path, and we have a callback function for the logic for that particular path. Now let's say that when the request comes in, we want to do some profiling. We want to see how long is it going to take to process this request. And we're going to use the payment logger for this, but you can do this with any Winston logger. What you do is you create a variable, and I'm going to call that variable profiler. And we can use the payment logger, and we can call the .startTimer method in order to get back a profiler. So this internally is going to be counting the time from when you call this start timer function until the time when you tell the profiler to stop calculating that time delta. So in this request handler, we're going to simulate some sort of processing here. So I'm going to paste some code in. We have a variable called 1 billion, and we are creating a for loop here where we are running through the numbers between 0 and 1 billion and multiplying each one of them by 2. So that's not very useful, but it's going to simulate a request, it's going to simulate some latency. And then once we're done with that particular bit of compute, we can call the profiler.done method. And the done method can take a JavaScript object, so I'm going to pass a key here called message, and we can pass a message in here. And I'm actually going to use a template string and pass this message, request to the path processed. And the path is what's coming into the function as a parameter. So that is going to cancel this timer when we call the profiler.done method. So the last thing to do is actually just call the request handler function. So let's go down below the definition, and we're going to call it, and because this is using the payment logger, let's just pass a URL path here of /payment. We can then save this, and I'm going to execute this on the terminal. So let's run this, and we're not getting any output on the terminal. We need to go to the payments.log file, and you can see the new key that we have in this log. So we're outputting the duration in milliseconds between calling the start timer function here and then calling profiler.done when that processing is finished. That will output to your logs the duration in milliseconds along with the level and the message. and the message is just what we pass in here to the profiler.done function. And that's all we need to know here in order to do some very basic profiling with Winston. So let's finish this video by showing how we can send our logs to a centralized service, and we're going to send them to 𝗵𝗽stack, where we can effectively search and analyze the logs and find interesting incidents that are happening in our applications. Now, in order to do that, we need to install a new transport. We've already seen this concept of transports, but we have a community-driven transport for 𝗵𝗽stack. And I'm going to go to this page in the 𝗵𝗽stack documentation here. This will be linked below the video, and we can see how we can use the Winston transport for 𝗵𝗽stack. Now, to start with, we need to install these packages. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to paste that npm install command in here. And that's going to install these into our Node.js project. Now, once that's installed, we're going to go to the browser, and we're going to create a new source. And we're on the 𝗵𝗽stack log service here, and a source basically represents a service where you want to collect logs from. So let's create a new one at the top right with the connect source button, and I'm going to call this one Winston Demo, and that platform for this is going to be a JavaScript Node.js application. Then we can click the create source button, and you can see the source has been created, and what we get back here is some options. We have a source token, and that's important. We're going to need to copy that, so I'm going to click this and that will copy that to the clipboard. And we also have some other options here, for example data retention, which is set to 3 days by default on this plan. Now let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to go to loggers.py, and right at the top here I'm going to create a variable called token, and I'm going to set that equal to the token that I've copied. Now, in production you definitely don't want to do this. You don't want a hard-coded token in your application. What you can do instead is read this from process.env as an example if it's coming from an environment file. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to hard-code this for demonstration. Let's now go back to the 𝗵𝗽stack documentation, and we can look at the setup section here for the Winston transport. We need to have a couple of imports at the top here. So I'm going to copy these, and let's go back to VS Code, and at the top of loggers.py, we're going to bring those in. Once we've done that, we need to create a logtail object, and we can do that here by instantiating it and passing the token in. So I'm going to copy this line of code, and just underneath the token we can paste that in there, and we can replace this source token here with the variable that we created on the line above. So we now have a logtail client. What we need to do is then create the transport. So let's go back to the documentation, and you can see that we can create a new logtail transport and pass that logtail client in. So I'm going to copy that statement and go back to VS Code, and I'm going to go down to both of the loggers that we have here. These have a transports option that's set to a JavaScript array, so we can pass the logtail transport as the final option here, and we can do the same in the payment logger as well. So as well as the file transport, we can specify a second transport, and that's the logtail transport. Once we've added that, we can go back to app.js. Now, the request handler, that function is going to do that profiling, and it's going to output some logs to the payment logger. What I want to do as well is add an order logger statement, so order logger.info, and let's pass a message in here and just say that an order was placed. Now, if we save this and we go back to our terminal and we rerun the node app.js command, this is going to run the script that we have, and hopefully we're going to see that it's going to send the logs to 𝗵𝗽stack. So let's go back to the platform here, and we can look at the live tail of these logs, and hopefully we're going to see these, and we do. So the 𝗵𝗽stack Winston transport has sent this information to the platform, and we can see the log entries being collected in this live tail. Now we can dive in and see more information about each entry. For example, the request to the /payment endpoint. If we expand this, we can see some of the details, including the duration in milliseconds that was added by that profiler. And of course we can also see the level and the message and other information. And what's useful about this is that we can go to the search bar at the top here, and we can define some kind of lookup that we want to perform over our entire logs. For example, we know we have a key called duration in milliseconds, and 𝗵𝗽stack knows that that key exists, and it's indexed that so we can search very efficiently over the logs to find entries that contain that key. Now, we don't need to specify an equality. We can also do something like a greater than lookup. And if we wanted to find all requests that were taking greater than 500 milliseconds, in other words, a request that's not performing as efficiently as we might expect, we can specify greater than 500, and then we can search through the logs to find those. And we can see we get this back because this particular log took 974 milliseconds. So if we change this search option at the top here to 1000 and we tried again, we don't get any matching logs for that one. So we can use these searches to find interesting information from the logs that have been collected, and we can use that information to build charts and dashboards. We can set up alerts and do general analysis of our logs very easily when it's in a centralized location such as this. So that's all for this video. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the 𝗵𝗽𝗀 channel. And if you're interested in more of these types of videos, for example, how to use Winston in a Next.js application, or how to do log rotation and other topics like that, let us know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.